I was supposed to be home late that night. Work had dragged on and the idea of returning to an empty house had weighed on me. So I finished my last meeting, grabbed a coffee to go and headed back earlier than planned. As I approached our front door, I noticed something odd: laughter. It wasn't just any laughter, it was hers. Jenny's laugh, the one that used to be just for me. Only this time it was accompanied by a man's voice. I froze on the doorstep, my hand hovering over the doorknob. It was Jason, our neighbor, the guy I'd shared beers with on game nights, the one who'd borrowed my tools a dozen times. At first I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they were watching a movie, or Jason had stopped by for something. But something in my gut told me differently. I quietly turned the knob and pushed the door open, just enough to see inside. The sight that greeted me was like a slap to the face. There, on our couch, was Jenny, my Jenny, wrapped in Jason's arms, their bodies tangled together in a way that left no room for doubt. Their clothes lay scattered on the floor, discarded like the promises we had made to each other. They didn't notice me. Too caught up in each other, too lost in their betrayal. I felt sick. My stomach churned and for a moment I thought I might actually throw up. But instead, I just stood there, frozen in place, watching the life I had built with her crumble before my eyes. Every instinct screamed at me to rush in, to pull Jason off her, to scream at both of them, but I didn't. I couldn't. I turned around, walked back out the door and left. The cold air hit me as I stepped outside, but it barely registered. My body moved on autopilot, driving to the nearest hotel, the shock numbing the pain that would inevitably come later. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I had seen, of how blind I'd been. How long had it been going on? How many times had she lied to me while I had trusted her completely? By morning, something inside me snapped. There was no screaming, no accusations, no public showdown. That would be too easy for them. They had stolen my peace, my trust, and my dignity, and now it was my turn. I didn't just want to end it. I wanted them to feel the same helplessness, the same gut-wrenching pain that I did. I wanted to watch their perfect little world burn. That's when I came up with my plan. Jason had a wife, Kate. She was kind, soft-spoken, and completely unaware of what her husband had been doing behind her back. They had kids, a nice house. They were the kind of couple who hosted barbecues in the summer and sent out Christmas cards every year. They seemed perfect, but I knew now that perfection was a lie. And I was about to expose it. I didn't confront Jenny. I didn't let on that I knew. Instead, I waited. I played my part, while secretly laying the groundwork for my revenge. I started small, an anonymous letter. It was addressed to Kate, telling her that her husband wasn't the man she thought he was. I kept it vague at first, just enough to plant the seed of doubt in her mind. I watched their house every day after that, waiting for signs that the letter had done its job. Within a week, I saw the shift. Kate stopped smiling. Her usual cheeriness was replaced with worry, with suspicion. Jason, clueless as ever, continued as though nothing had changed, not realizing the storm that was brewing right under his roof. The second letter came next. This time, it wasn't just words, it was proof. I had taken photos that night. My phone had been in my pocket, and through the crack in the door, I had snapped a few blurry but unmistakable shots of Jason and Jenny together. I mailed them to Kate without a return address. The pictures would be undeniable. There would be no way for Jason to talk his way out of it. 2 weeks later, I watched from my living room window as Kate finally confronted him. Their fight spilled out onto the front lawn. I could hear her shouting at him, her voice breaking with rage and heartbreak. Jason tried to calm her down, but it was too late. His lies had caught up with him. She threw him out that night, and I watched with cold satisfaction as he loaded his things into the car and drove off. Jenny noticed the change in me, of course. How could she not? I was colder, more distant. She tried to talk to me, to ask what was wrong, but I shut her out. She had no idea that I knew everything, that I was the one pulling the strings behind the scenes, tearing Jason's life apart piece by piece. It was only a matter of time before everything fell apart for her too. The tension in the house grew heavier with each passing day. Jenny noticed, of course. She was too smart not to. Her attempts at casual conversation felt forced and strained. The same woman who once laughed so easily now walked on eggshells, sensing something had shifted. But she didn't ask the real question. Not yet. I think part of her was afraid to know. I watched her closely, pretending everything was fine while I calculated my next move. After Jason was kicked out, he stopped coming around. I'd see him in passing, disheveled, distant. He was a shadow of the man who used to flash me cocky smiles over the fence. He hadn't just lost his wife, he'd lost his kids too. Kate wasn't going to let him anywhere near them, not after what I'd exposed. Jenny seemed puzzled by his sudden absence, but she didn't dare reach out. Maybe she thought I'd find out. Maybe she was too caught up in her own guilt to press the issue, but I could tell it was bothering her. She was nervous and anxious, always checking her phone like she was waiting for some message that never came. One night, as she sat at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone, I walked in and grabbed a beer from the fridge. I could feel her eyes on me, could sense that she was building up the courage to ask something. I leaned against the counter, taking a long sip, waiting for her to speak. "Mike, is everything okay?" she finally asked, her voice tentative. She set her phone down, staring at me with wide, searching eyes. "Everything's fine," I replied, not even looking at her. It was a lie, of course, but it rolled off my tongue with such ease. I took another swig of beer. the cold liquid doing nothing to douse the fire of rage still burning inside me. She didn't seem convinced. "You've been different lately, distant." I glanced at her then, and for a brief second I considered laying it all out, telling her exactly why I'd been different, why things would never be the same. But instead I shrugged. "Just work. A lot on my mind." She looked down, fidgeting with her wedding ring. The sight of it made my blood boil. That same ring, the one that was supposed to represent our bond, our loyalty. Now it was nothing but a reminder of her betrayal. "Jason hasn't been around much either," she added, her voice quieter. "Have you noticed?" That was it, the crack I'd been waiting for. She couldn't help herself. Despite everything, she was still thinking about him, still wondering why her lover had disappeared. I clenched the beer bottle tighter, the glass cold against my palm. "Yeah, I noticed," I said slowly. "I'm sure his wife noticed too." Jenny's head snapped up, her eyes wide with confusion. "What do you mean?" I pushed off the counter and walked toward her, my gaze locked on hers. I could see the fear flicker in her eyes, the way her breath caught in her throat. She knew. Deep down she knew what was coming, but she couldn't stop it. "Kate found out," I said, my voice cold and deliberate. "About everything. The affair, Jason, you." Jenny's face drained of color, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. She just sat there, staring at me, frozen. "How?" She finally managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told her," I replied, watching the shock wash over her like a tidal wave. "I sent her letters, pictures, proof." The room fell silent. Jenny's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. "Why? Why would you do that?" They laughed, a dark, humorless sound. "Why?" I repeated, stepping closer. "Because you destroyed everything, Jenny. You think I didn't know? You think I was blind to what was happening right under my nose?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mike. I'm so sorry. It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "You don't destroy someone's life by accident. You made a choice. You chose him. You chose to betray me." Jenny broke down then, sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking. But her tears did nothing to soften my resolve. I had waited for this moment, the moment when she would finally understand what she had done, the damage she had caused. "You ruined our marriage," I said, my voice lower now but just as hard. "And now Jason's paying for it. His family is gone, and it's because of you." Jenny looked up, her face pale and streaked with tears. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't want this." "Well, it's too late," I said coldly. "You wanted him? Now he's ruined. And guess what? You are too." She stared at me, her mouth moving soundlessly, trying to find the right words. But there were none. There was nothing she could say that would undo what she had done. "I should have known," I continued, shaking my head. "I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. And now all that's left is for you to live with what you've done." With that, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her there, broken and sobbing, the weight of her actions finally crashing down on her. The game was far from over, but now she knew the rules. Now she knew that nothing would ever be the same. As I left the house, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Jason had lost everything, and Jenny was finally facing the consequences of her betrayal. I had spent weeks planning this, watching it all unravel, and now the mask had finally slipped. The perfect life she thought she had was gone, and I had made sure of that. But this was just the beginning. The house was quieter after that night. Jenny barely spoke to me. The tension was thick, like the calm before a storm that both of us knew was coming but neither could predict. I moved through the days like a ghost, pretending we still had some semblance of normalcy, but inside I was watching her unravel, little by little. She started avoiding me, leaving the house for hours at a time, trying to escape the reality that I had forced her to confront. I could tell she was desperate, searching for a way to make sense of it all, to fix what couldn't be fixed. But I was past the point of caring about what she did or where she went. I was in control now and she knew it. Jason, on the other hand, wasn't doing any better. Kate had kicked him out for good. I'd seen him a few times driving past our street, his face twisted in anger and desperation. He must have known that Jenny and I were still together, at least physically, and that must have been eating him alive. The man had lost his family and his home, and his affair had gone cold. He was left with nothing. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch, nursing a beer and watching the neighborhood go by when Jason pulled up in front of the house. He got out of the car, his steps heavy with purpose, and for a moment, I wondered if he was going to try something. A fight, maybe. Part of me hoped he would. It would give me a reason to unload all the rage I'd been carrying around. But when he reached the porch, he just stood there staring at me, his eyes hollow and red-rimmed. He didn't say anything for a long time, just shifted awkwardly as if trying to find the right words. "I need to talk to Jenny," he finally muttered, his voice strained. I took a sip of my beer, letting the silence stretch. "Jenny's not here." Jason frowned, his frustration barely contained. "Look, man, I know things are messed up. I just messed you up?" I cut him off, raising an eyebrow. "That's an interesting way to describe it." He clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I'm trying to make things right with her. I just need to talk to her, okay? This is between me and her." I stood up slowly, setting my beer down on the porch railing. "Between you and her?" I repeated, stepping closer. "No, Jason. It was never just between you and her. You came into my house, you fucked my wife, and now your family is gone because of it." His face twisted in anger, and for a moment I thought he was going to swing at me, but instead he just exhaled sharply, trying to keep his cool. "You don't understand. he muttered, shaking his head. I understand more than you think, I said, my voice calm but sharp. And you know what? You deserve every bit of this. You deserve to lose everything. Jason's shoulders slumped, the fight leaving him. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out, left with nothing but regret and the ruins of his own choices. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, slamming the door behind him before speeding off down the street. As I watched him disappear, I felt that same cold satisfaction creeping over me. He had come looking for something, maybe closure, maybe redemption, but he would find neither. Not from me. After Jason's visit, something shifted in Jenny. She came home that evening, her face pale, her eyes distant. I didn't ask where she'd been. I didn't care. But I could tell she was unraveling faster than I expected. That night she broke down completely. It was late. The house was dark except for the dim glow of the TV in the living room. I sat on the couch, staring at the screen but not really watching. Jenny came down the stairs, her footsteps slow and hesitant, as if she didn't want to disturb the fragile balance of silence that had settled between us. When she walked into the living room, she didn't sit down. She just stood there, arms wrapped around herself, her face drawn and exhausted. I could see the cracks in her armor, the way the guilt and shame had eaten away at her, leaving nothing but a shell of the woman I once knew. Mike, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to fix this. I didn't look at her. I just kept my eyes on the TV, ignoring the tremble in her voice. I don't know what to do, she continued, her voice breaking. I thought I could make it right, but I can't. I can't fix it yet. She was crying now, her breath hitching as she tried to hold it together. But it was too late. She was falling apart and I wasn't going to catch her this time. I'm sorry, she sobbed, sinking to her knees on the floor in front of me. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I finally looked down at her. The woman I had once loved was now a broken mess at my feet. Her hands were shaking as she reached for me as if she still believed that somehow I could forgive her, that we could go back to the way things were. But there was no going back. I loved you, Jenny, I said quietly, the words heavy with the weight of everything we had lost. I trusted you, and you destroyed that. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, and I'm so sorry. Please, Mike, I can't do this anymore. I need you. I need you, us. I shook my head slowly, standing up and stepping away from her. There is no us, Jenny, not anymore. She cried harder, her sobs echoing through the empty house, but I didn't turn back. I walked upstairs, leaving her there, broken and desperate, knowing that no amount of apologies or tears could change what had happened. As I lay in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, listening to her sobs downstairs. The sound was hollow and distant, like an echo from a life that was already gone. It wasn't that I didn't feel anything, I did. But the anger had burned too deep, and now all that was left was cold resolve. Jenny had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences, just like Jason. Tomorrow, I'd be gone. The next morning, the sun barely peeked over the horizon when I finished packing my things. The suitcase sat by the door, a quiet reminder that this was it, the end. I wasn't taking much, just enough to get by for a while. The rest of it didn't matter anymore. The house, the furniture, the memories, they were all tainted, infected by the betrayal that had slowly poisoned everything. Jenny was still asleep when I left the bedroom. Her face, tear-streaked and pale, lay half buried in the pillow. She looked fragile, almost peaceful in the early morning light, but I couldn't forget what she'd done, who she really was underneath all of it. As I stood there watching her one last time, a part of me almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then the images of her with Jason flashed through my mind. The lies, the deceit, the years wasted on a woman who never really valued me. The sympathy faded. I walked downstairs quietly, not wanting to wake her, not wanting to have the final dramatic confrontation I knew would lead to nothing. I had said all I needed to say. We had torn each other down enough. This was my final act of control, to leave without a word. She wouldn't get the satisfaction of pleading with me to stay, of begging for more forgiveness she didn't deserve. The house felt emptier than ever as I moved through it. Each step echoed in the silence, amplifying the feeling that this place, once my home, was nothing but a hollow shell now. I passed the living room where we'd spent countless evenings together, laughing, talking about the future, all lies. I'd been blind to the cracks that had been forming right in front of me. At the door I hesitated, taking one last look back. There was no sense of regret, no second thoughts. Just a strange stillness, as if the final thread of the life I once had was snapping in two. I opened the door, letting the cold morning air rush in, and stepped outside. I'd already made arrangements. A few days at a hotel, followed by whatever came next. I didn't have a solid plan, but that didn't bother me. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't stay. The life I had built here was gone. There was no point in clinging to the ruins of something that had already collapsed. As I loaded my suitcase into the trunk of my car, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, and there she was, Jenny. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a robe, her hair messy from sleep, her eyes swollen from the tears she had cried all night. She looked broken, like a ghost of the woman I once loved. Mike, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Please, don't go. I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air. There was a time when those words would have stopped me in my tracks, when the thought of leaving her would have been unbearable. But that time had passed. I have to, I said quietly, shutting the trunk and turning to face her fully. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she took a step forward as if closing the distance between us could somehow bridge the chasm that had opened up over the last few weeks. "We can fix this," she begged, her voice shaking. "We can go to therapy, we can talk." "There's nothing left to fix," I cut her off, my tone steady, final. "You made your choice, Jenny. I can't forgive that. I won't." She broke down. Then, covering her face with her hands, her body shaking with sobs. But the sight of her tears, her pain, did nothing to sway me. I'd been through enough. I had given enough. "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice muffled. "I never meant to hurt you. I don't know why I did it. It doesn't matter," I said, my voice cold but calm. "It's done." She lowered her hands, her face streaked with tears, desperation in her eyes. "Please, please don't leave me like this." I shook my head, stepping closer but keeping my distance. "You'll survive, Jenny, just like I will. But I can't be here anymore." Her sobs quieted, and she wiped her face with the sleeve of her robe. She stood there, defeated, knowing there was nothing left to say, no argument that could change my mind. I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, she took one last step forward, her voice barely audible. "I love you." I looked at her through the window, the weight of those words hanging between us like a cruel joke. I could have said it back. I could have lied and made her believe for just one more moment that everything might be okay. But I didn't. Instead, I put the car in gear and drove away, leaving her standing on the porch, watching me disappear down the road. As the distance between us grew, I felt the final bit of tension in my chest release. The weight of it all, the lies, the betrayal, the anger began to lift. There was still pain, sure, that would take time to fade, but for the first time in weeks I felt something close to peace. Jenny would have to face the wreckage of her choices alone now. And as for me, I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew it was far from here, far from her, far from the mess we had both made of our lives. The road stretched out before me, open and empty, and I drove on, leaving the past behind. A week had passed since I left Jenny. The hotel room where I was staying was sparse, just a bed, a chair, and a small desk with a half-empty bottle of whiskey on it. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, closure maybe, or just the numbness that comes after the anger has burned itself out. I hadn't heard from Jenny since that morning on the porch. She hadn't tried to call, and I hadn't bothered to check in. I assumed she was still at the house, still trying to pick up the pieces of the life we'd once shared, but I didn't care enough to find out. But there was one person who hadn't given up. Jason. He started calling me and sending texts. The first few I ignored. What could he possibly have to say that I wanted to hear? But as the days went on, his messages became more frantic, more desperate. He showed up at the hotel once, banging on my door, but I didn't answer. On the 7th day, as I sat in the hotel room staring at the wall, my phone buzzed again. Another text from Jason. I sighed, ready to ignore it like all the others, but something in me snapped. I opened the message. It was short and to the point. "We need to talk. You've ruined everything." A cold smile crept across my face. Ruined everything? That was the point. For a moment I thought about deleting the text, turning off my phone and leaving him to drown in the mess he'd helped create. But then something inside me stirred. I wanted to see him squirm, to face the wreckage I'd left in my wake. So I texted back. "Fine. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. at the bar by the hotel." The next day I walked into the bar a few minutes before 4. It was a dimly lit dive, the kind of place where the bartenders didn't ask too many questions and the regulars didn't bother to pretend they weren't running from something. I took a seat at the bar, ordered a drink and waited. Jason showed up right on time. He walked in looking like hell. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and the bags under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept in days. He spotted me immediately and walked over, sitting down next to me without a word. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I sipped my drink, watching him out of the corner of my eye as he shifted nervously in his seat. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered after a long silence, rubbing his hands together anxiously. "How about you start with, 'I'm sorry,'" I said flatly, not bothering to look at him. Jason exhaled sharply, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Yeah, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry I slept with Jenny. I'm sorry I screwed up. But this, what did you do? You destroyed my entire life, man." I turned to face him, my expression calm. "You destroyed your own life, Jason. I just made sure you felt the consequences." He let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah? Well, congratulations. You won. Kate's gone, the kids hate me, and I lost everything. Are you happy now?" I took another sip of my drink, letting his words hang in the air. "You made your choice. You knew what you were doing when you went after Jenny. You didn't think about Kate. You didn't think about your kids. You sure as hell didn't think about me." Jason slammed his fist on the bar, causing a few heads to turn. "I didn't think it would go this far. I didn't think you'd—" "What?" I interrupted, my voice icy. "That I'd just roll over and take it? That I wouldn't fight back?" He clenched his jaw, glaring at me. "You could have come to me, man. You could have told me to back off. We could have what?" I snapped, turning fully to face him now. "Had a nice little chat? Do you think that would have changed anything? You think I didn't see how you looked at her? How you took every opportunity to make me feel small, to rub it in my face that you were screwing my wife?" Jason opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off again. "You didn't just sleep with Jenny, Jason. You betrayed me. You took everything I had and you expected me to just let it go? You wanted to ruin my life, so I ruined yours first." He looked away, his hands gripping the edge of the bar, knuckles white. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. That's bullshit, and you know it, I said coldly. You just didn't care. You thought you could have it all, your wife, your kids, and my wife too. But now you've got nothing. Jason was silent for a long time, staring at the bar as if it held the answers to all his problems. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, defeated. What do I do now? How do I fix this? I almost laughed. There's nothing to fix, Jason. It's over. You lost your family. I lost mine. And there's no coming back from that. He looked at me then, his eyes hollow, filled with the weight of what he had done. I loved her, you know. Jenny. I stared at him, feeling a flash of anger rise up again, but I forced it down. It didn't matter anymore. Yeah? And where did that get you? He shook his head, his face a mix of regret and self-pity. Nowhere. We sat in silence for a while after that, the noise of the bar fading into the background. Jason looked broken, his shoulders slumped, his spirit crushed. I had taken everything from him just like he had taken everything from me, and yet sitting there I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. There was no real victory in this. I finished my drink, stood up and looked down at him one last time. I told you, Jason, you reap what you sow. He didn't respond, just kept staring at the bar in front of him, lost in the wreckage of his own making. I turned and walked out of the bar, leaving him to drown in the consequences of his choices, just as I had. As I stepped out into the cold evening air, I felt a strange sense of emptiness settle in. The revenge I had plotted, the destruction I had caused, it was done. But it hadn't fixed anything. I was still alone, still broken, still trying to figure out what came next, but at least now I didn't have to carry the weight of pretending anymore. A few days passed in a blur after my final encounter with Jason. The satisfaction of watching him collapse under the weight of his own choices hadn't lasted long. The silence in the hotel room grew heavier, and I found myself running out of reasons to stay. The whiskey that had once helped numb the pain was only making things worse, amplifying the emptiness inside me. One evening, I was lying on the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. Who would be calling me now? But something compelled me to pick it up just to break the monotony of the silence. Hello? I said, my voice rough from disuse. Mike? A woman's voice, hesitant, uncertain. For a moment, I didn't recognize it, and then it clicked. Kate, Jason's wife. I sat up abruptly, the phone clutched in my hand. Kate? Yeah, she replied softly. There was a long pause as if she was trying to gather her thoughts. I know this is unexpected. I wasn't sure if I should even call you, but why are you calling me? I interrupted, not out of rudeness but genuine confusion. I hadn't spoken to Kate since her world had imploded. She had kicked Jason out, and I assumed she had moved on, trying to rebuild her life away from the wreckage he had caused. I wanted to talk, she said quietly. About everything. About Jason. About Jenny. I didn't know what to say. What could we possibly talk about? I had destroyed her family and mine was shattered. The last thing I wanted was to dredge up old wounds, especially with someone who had suffered as much as I had. Mike, please, Kate continued when I didn't respond. I know it's strange, but I think we need to have this conversation. There are things I need to understand. Things we both need to you understand. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the cracks beneath the surface. She was holding it together barely, just like me. Okay, I said finally, let's meet. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe just outside of town. It wasn't far from her new apartment, a place she had rented after kicking Jason out. I arrived a few minutes early, feeling an odd mixture of dread and curiosity. What did she want from me? Closure? Answers? Did she want to confront me for ruining her life? I wasn't sure I had any answers to give. When Kate walked in, I was struck by how different she looked. She seemed thinner, more fragile than I remembered. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her eyes were tired as if she hadn't slept in weeks. But there was a quiet strength in her as well, a determination that hadn't been there before. Thanks for meeting me, she said, sitting down across from me. I nodded, unsure of how to start this conversation. She ordered a coffee and we sat in awkward silence for a moment before she finally spoke. I know what you did, she said quietly, looking down at her hands. The letters, the anonymous notes. It was you, wasn't it? I felt my stomach drop. Of course she had figured it out. How could she not? I had been sloppy toward the end, more focused on Jason's destruction than covering my tracks. For a brief moment, I considered lying, denying it, but what was the point? Yes, I admitted. It was me. Kate nodded, as if she had already known the answer but needed to hear it from me. She didn't seem angry, though. Instead, there was a sadness in her eyes that I hadn't expected. I thought so, she said softly. I'm not here to blame you, Mike. What Jason did, it was unforgivable. You were just reacting to it. I get that. I watched her carefully, trying to gauge where this conversation was going. So why are we here, Kate? Why did you want to talk to me? She took a deep breath as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. I've been thinking about everything that's happened. About Jason, about Jenny, about us. And I realized something. We were both hurt. We were both betrayed. But instead of dealing with it, we tore each other apart. You went after Jason, I pushed him out. And now we're both sitting here, alone, trying to figure out what's left. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She wasn't wrong. I had been so consumed with revenge, so focused on making Jason and Jenny pay for what they had done, that I hadn't stopped to consider what I was destroying in the process. Now sitting here with Kate, I realized that in my quest to make them suffer, I had only succeeded in making us all suffer. So what now? I asked quietly. Kate looked up at me, her eyes full of the same sadness and exhaustion I felt in myself. I don't know, but maybe we can stop the bleeding. Maybe we can start to heal somehow. I didn't know if healing was possible, but for the first time in a long time I wanted to try. After that meeting with Kate, something shifted. We didn't become instant friends, and we certainly didn't bond over shared trauma like some cheap movie plot. But there was an understanding between us now, a silent acknowledgement of what we had both lost and what we had left. That understanding didn't fix anything, but it helped. A few days later, Kate texted me again. This time it wasn't about Jason or Jenny, it was about her kids. They're asking about their dad, she wrote. I don't know what to tell them, can we talk? I agreed, though I wasn't sure how I could help. What was I supposed to say? That their father was a cheater, a liar? That he had destroyed everything because he couldn't keep his hands off another man's wife? But I owed Kate something, if only for the part I played in all of this. We met at the same cafe, though this time, the atmosphere between us was a little easier. We talked about the kids, how they were struggling to understand why their dad wasn't coming home, why everything had changed so suddenly. I didn't have any magical answers, but I listened. I told her what I had felt, what I had learned from my own broken pieces. Kids are resilient, I said finally, but they need the truth, even if it's messy. Don't sugarcoat it. Just tell them their dad made a mistake, a big one, and that it doesn't change how much they mean to him. Kate nodded, her expression pensive. I'm trying, it's just hard. I understood. None of this was easy, but talking about it with her and sharing our experiences made it feel a little less overwhelming. Over the next few weeks we met a few more times. We didn't always talk about the mess Jason and Jenny had made. Sometimes we just talked about normal things, the weather, work, and the small, mundane details of life that still kept moving even when everything else felt stuck. It was strange, this fragile alliance we had formed. We weren't friends exactly, but we weren't enemies either. We were just two people trying to pick up the pieces of our lives, trying to figure out how to move forward without being consumed by the past. One evening, after one of our meetings, Kate asked me a question that caught me off guard. Do you think they're still seeing each other? She asked quietly. I hadn't considered it. After everything that had happened, I had assumed Jenny and Jason were done. But now the thought crept into my mind, dark and unwelcome. I don't know, I admitted. But it doesn't matter, does it? We've already walked away. Kate nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. We both knew that while we had tried to walk away, the scars were still there, raw and unhealed. Whether they were together or not didn't change what had happened. But the possibility of it still lingered, a reminder of the betrayal that had brought us here in the first place. As I drove back to the hotel that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, the past wasn't done with us yet. Days passed, and despite the tentative peace I had found in my conversations with Kate, I couldn't stop thinking about her last question. Are they still seeing each other? The doubt she'd planted grew quietly, gnawing at me, even though I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter. I told myself I had walked away from all that their affair was old news, that my life and Kate's had already crumbled because of it. But I couldn't let it go. Late at night, when the silence of the hotel room became too much, I'd lie awake wondering if Jenny and Jason were still together. Had they picked up the pieces of their lives while I was left sitting in the ruins of mine? I didn't have the guts to ask Kate again. I didn't want to drag her back into the mess I was feeling. She was struggling to move on, just like I was. But there were whispers in town, vague, passing comments from people who knew what had happened. The more I heard, the more it started to sound like Jenny and Jason hadn't given up on each other. It wasn't long before the whispers turned into something louder. I was at the grocery store one afternoon, mindlessly throwing things into my cart when I heard two women talking in the next aisle. They weren't being particularly quiet, and their conversation was impossible to ignore. I heard Jenny was spotted with Jason again, one of them said, her voice low but clearly gossipy. Can you believe it? After all the damage they caused. The other woman scoffed. Typical. People like that don't care who they hurt. It's like they think they're above consequences. I stood frozen in place, gripping the cart handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. I shouldn't have been surprised, but hearing it confirmed by someone else made it all feel real again. The anger I had buried started bubbling up, mixing with the bitterness and pain I thought I had gotten past. Jenny and Jason hadn't just destroyed their marriages, they had blown up my life, Kate's life, and everything in between. And now, after all of that, they were still sneaking around like nothing had happened. I left the store without buying anything. My heart pounded as I drove back to the hotel, the wheels in my mind spinning as fast as the car's tires on the pavement. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch them get away with it again. I drove past the house late that night. The house I used to share with Jenny, the one that still held the ghosts of our old life together. It looked the same from the outside, a neat, ordinary home in a quiet neighborhood. But I knew what had happened inside those walls. I knew the lies and betrayal that had rotted it from the inside out. The lights were on. Jenny was home. For a moment I thought about just knocking on the door, forcing a confrontation right there on the front porch, but I didn't. Instead, I pulled the car over to the side of the street, hidden in the shadows, and waited. Part of me wasn't even sure what I was waiting for, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going to find out soon enough. An hour passed and then, just when I started to think I had made a mistake, I saw another car pull up. My chest tightened as I recognized it, Jason's car. I watched him get out and walk up to the house like he belonged there, like nothing had ever changed. My hands clenched the steering wheel, my pulse quickening. There was no doubt now. They hadn't ended it. They were still carrying on with their secret little affair. It wasn't about the betrayal anymore. This wasn't about my broken heart or Jenny's lies. It was about the fact that they had continued to disrespect everything. Me, Kate, their families, with no consequences. They were playing with fire, and I had let it happen. I couldn't let it go on any longer. Without thinking, I stepped out of the car and started walking toward the house. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was going to say or do, but the anger that had been simmering for weeks was finally boiling over. Before I even reached the door, Jason stepped out. He didn't see me at first, his eyes down as he fumbled for his keys, probably to lock the door behind him. But when he looked up and saw me standing there, his face paled. For a moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Mike," he said, his voice tight. "What the hell are you doing here?" I didn't answer right away. I just stared at him, my chest heaving with anger I hadn't realized was still buried so deep. "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice low, dangerous. "What are you doing here, Jason?" He glanced back at the house nervously, clearly hoping Jenny wouldn't come out. I saw the guilt flash across his face, but he tried to play it off. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" I interrupted, taking a step closer. "You don't want trouble? You think you can keep screwing my wife and sneaking around like nothing's happened, and I'm the one causing trouble?" Jason flinched at my words, but he didn't back down. "It's not like that," he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. "We were just what?" I snapped, cutting him off. "Still lying? Still pretending that none of this matters? Do you even realize the damage you've caused? Or are you just so wrapped up in yourself that you think you can keep getting away with it?" Jason finally broke, his face contorting in frustration. "I get it, all right. I messed up. But this isn't your business anymore. You left. You're out of the picture. Why can't you just—" "I left because you gave me no choice," I shouted, my anger finally spilling over. "You and Jenny destroyed everything. And now you're telling me to just forget it? To move on while you two keep sneaking around behind everyone's back?" For a moment we stood there in tense silence, both of us breathing heavily, both of us knowing there was no going back from this. Jason ran a hand through his hair, looking more rattled than I'd ever seen him. "What do you want from me, Mike? An apology? Do you want me to grovel? I already lost everything, man." I stared at him, my jaw clenched, every muscle in my body tense. "No," I said finally. "I don't want an apology. I don't want anything from you." He looked at me confused. "Then why are you here?" "Because I want you to know that I see you. I know what you're doing. And I won't let you keep getting away with it." Jason's expression darkened. "You're crazy, man. This is between me and Jenny. You're out, just stay out of it." I took another step forward, closing the distance between us. "This was never just between you and Jenny. You dragged me into it when you started this. And I'm not done with you yet." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the door to the house opened and Jenny stepped out. The look of shock on her face when she saw us was almost satisfying. She glanced from me to Jason, panic flashing in her eyes. "Mike," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you doing here?" I didn't even look at her. My eyes stayed locked on Jason as I spoke. "I'm making sure you both understand something," I said coldly. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there together, knowing that their secret was no longer safe. The confrontation outside our old house left me with an unexpected sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control over something, even if it was just the knowledge that Jason and Jenny couldn't hide anymore. But that clarity also came with a heavy burden. There was no going back now. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing relentlessly. Half asleep, I reached for it, expecting another spam call or maybe Kate checking in. Instead, my screen was flooded with texts, missed calls, and notifications from social media. It took me a moment to realize why. Jenny had posted something. I clicked on her profile and immediately saw it, a long emotional post with a carefully staged photo of her sitting on the porch, looking broken and vulnerable. It was exactly the kind of thing she would do, using social media to frame herself as the victim. And it was working. The comments were pouring in, friends and acquaintances expressing shock, sympathy, and support for her. I never imagined my life would end up like this. Sometimes the people you trust the most betray you in the worst ways. I tried so hard to keep everything together, but it's time to face the truth. Some things are too broken to be fixed. She didn't mention me by name. She didn't mention Jason. But the message was clear enough for anyone who knew us. Jenny was trying to spin the narrative, painting herself as the one who had been hurt, the one left to pick up the pieces of our broken marriage. And now, everyone was rallying around her. I threw the phone down on the bed, a sick feeling rising in my chest. Of course she would do this. Of course she would find a way to manipulate the situation and twist the story to make herself look innocent. But I knew better, and so did Jason. I spent the rest of the day wrestling with my anger. Every time I thought about responding or posting my own version of the story, I stopped myself. There was no point in engaging with her online. It would just make me look bitter, like I was trying to get revenge. But the rage kept bubbling under the surface. Jenny had already destroyed my life, and now she was trying to rewrite the history of our marriage in front of everyone. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and texted Kate. She deserved to know what was happening. She had been dragged into this mess just as much as I had. "Mike, did you see what Jenny posted?" A few minutes later my phone buzzed with her reply. Kate, yeah, I saw it. Are you okay? I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Was I okay? Not really. But I didn't know how to say that without sounding like I was losing control again. Mike, it's just another one of her games. She's trying to make everyone forget what she did. It's like she wants to come out of this looking like the victim. There was a pause before Kate responded. Kate, I know. That's what people like her do. But the truth has a way of coming out even if it takes time. Her words were meant to be reassuring, but they did little to soothe the frustration building inside me. I couldn't just sit back and watch as Jenny rewrote our story, especially when I knew how easily people would buy into her lies. I needed to do something, but what? As I sat there staring at the ceiling, a thought occurred to me, something I hadn't considered before. I still had all of Jason's messages, the text between him and Jenny, the proof of their affair. It was all still there on my phone, a digital record of everything they had done. Up until now I had kept it to myself, thinking it was just ammunition in case things got ugly. Well, things were getting ugly. I knew it wasn't a smart move. Sharing those messages would be crossing a line I wasn't sure I could come back from. But if Jenny wanted to play games, I wasn't going to sit by quietly and let her win. She had already taken so much from me. She didn't get to take my truth too. Before I could talk myself out of it, I started copying the texts. I selected the worst ones, the ones where they had planned their secret meetings, where they had laughed at my expense, where Jenny had made it clear that our marriage was nothing more than an inconvenience to her. With each message I copied, my heart pounded harder in my chest. When I was done, I took a deep breath and opened my social media account. This was it, the moment I took control. I started typing a post. My hands were shaking, but I didn't stop. I wasn't going to say anything, but after seeing Jenny's post, I feel like I need to speak up. The truth is, she wasn't the one betrayed. She was the one doing the betraying. While we were married, Jenny had an affair with Jason, our neighbor, someone we both trusted. Here's the proof. I attached screenshots of the texts, the damning messages that laid everything bare. For a moment I hovered over the post button, my finger trembling as I considered the consequences. Once I hit that button, there was no going back. The truth would be out, but so would everything else, the mess, the chaos, the fallout. But I was done living in the shadows of their lies. I pressed the button. The post went live, and as soon as it did, my phone started blowing up with notifications. People were reacting instantly, shocked comments, questions, and messages flooding in from all sides. It was out there now. The truth was no longer a secret. I wasn't sure if I felt relief or fear, maybe both. An hour later, I got a text from Kate. Kate, Mike, what did you do? Her words hit me like a punch. Suddenly, the gravity of what I had done sank in. I had just thrown gasoline on an already burning fire. The fallout was going to be huge, not just for me, but for everyone involved. I didn't respond right away. What could I say? I had made my move. Now I just had to wait and see what would come of it. As the night wore on, I stared at my phone, watching as the notifications piled up, as my life unraveled online for the world to see. There was no turning back now. The fallout from my post hit faster than I expected. By the next morning, the whole town was buzzing. It felt like I had dropped a bomb, and the shockwaves rippled through every part of my life. I woke up to dozens of messages, a mix of people expressing support, curiosity, and of course judgment. Some of my closest friends texted, asking if I was okay. Others seemed to be distancing themselves, unsure of how to handle the drama. And then there were the strangers, people who had nothing to do with me, Jenny, or Jason, but somehow felt the need to weigh in. But the most important message came from Kate. Kate, I need to talk to you, now. There was no question in her words, just a sense of urgency that made my heart sink. I could tell she wasn't happy, and I braced myself for the conversation I knew was coming. I called her, my hand shaking as I held the phone to my ear. She picked up on the first ring. Mike, what the hell were you thinking? Her voice was tight, a mixture of anger and worry. I didn't know what else to do, I admitted, my chest tightening. She was making me look like the bad guy, like none of this was her fault. I couldn't just sit back and let her get away with it. And you think posting all of that online was the answer? Kate snapped. You just exposed everything, not just Jenny and Jason, but your entire life. This isn't something you can take back. Her words hit hard because I knew she was right. I had acted impulsively, driven by anger and the need to defend myself. But now that it was out there, I had no control over where the story would go, how people would react, or what it would do to the fragile pieces of my life I was trying to hold together. I know, I said quietly. I know it was a mistake. Kate sighed, her tone softening a little. I get why you're angry, Mike. Believe me, I do. But now everyone knows, and they're going to start picking sides. This is going to get ugly, and it's not just about you and Jenny anymore. I didn't want it to get this far, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. But I couldn't just keep quiet. I know, but now you have to deal with the consequences. There was a pause before she added, Are you ready for tat? I wasn't. I had unleashed something that was now completely out of my control. But it didn't matter if I was ready or not, the storm was already here. I'll figure it out, I said, though even I didn't believe the confidence in my voice. Just, be careful, Kate warned. People like Jenny, they don't go down quietly. She's going to fight back. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Thanks, Kate, I appreciate it. After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my phone. The comments were still rolling in. Some people praised me for exposing the truth while others condemned me for airing dirty laundry. But what hit me hardest were the private messages, the ones from people I hadn't spoken to in years, now offering their 2 cents on my personal life. It felt like everyone had an opinion, and none of it was going to help me fix the mess I'd made. By midday I got the notification I'd been dreading, Jenny had responded. Her post was long, emotional, and full of half-truths. She spun the narrative exactly how I expected, painting herself as the victim of a toxic marriage, someone who had made mistakes but had been pushed to the edge by me. She didn't deny the affair. She couldn't, not with the evidence I'd posted, but she made it sound like she had no choice, like I was the one who had driven her into Jason's arms. The comments on her post were even more brutal than mine. People sympathized with her, offering words of encouragement and telling her she didn't deserve the public humiliation I had forced on her. Some even called me out directly, accusing me of being petty and of trying to ruin her life out of spite. I stared at her post, feeling the anger rise again, but this time it was mixed with something else. Guilt. Had I gone too far? Before I could stop myself, I typed out a comment under her post. Tell the truth, Jenny. You weren't pushed into anything. You made your choice and now you have to live with it. I hit send, knowing it would only fuel the fire. But I was past the point of caring. In the aftermath of the online war between Jenny and me, there was one voice that remained suspiciously silent: Jason. I expected him to chime in, to defend Jenny, or at least try to justify his part in the whole mess. But there was nothing. Not a post, not a comment, not even a vague statement to distance himself from the drama. At first I thought maybe he was waiting for the right moment. Maybe he was too ashamed to show his face, or maybe he didn't know how to respond to the chaos I had unleashed. But the longer his silence dragged on, the more I started to wonder if something else was going on. It wasn't like Jason to stay quiet. He was always the type to insert himself into any situation, to make sure his side of the story was heard. And yet, here he was, completely absent while Jenny and I tore each other apart online. A week passed and still nothing. Meanwhile, the fallout from my post continued. People stopped me in the grocery store, asking how I was doing, pretending to care while clearly fishing for more gossip. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, claiming they were thinking of me, though I could tell most of them just wanted more details about the scandal. And through it all, Jason stayed silent. It wasn't until I got a text from one of our mutual friends, Greg, that I finally got a clue as to why. Greg: hey man, just heard some news about Jason, thought you should know. I frowned, typing back. Me, what kind of news? Greg: he and Jenny. They're not talking anymore. I guess after your post things blew up between them. He's been laying low, trying to avoid the fallout. I stared at the screen, not sure how to feel. On one hand, part of me was glad Jason was getting what he deserved. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Something wasn't adding up. Me: you're saying they broke up? Greg: looks that way. Word is Jason's wife is filing for divorce and Jenny's not happy about it. I sat back, letting the information sink in. Jason's silence suddenly made sense. He wasn't just avoiding the public mess, he was dealing with his own personal fallout. His wife, who had probably seen the same texts I posted, had finally had enough. Jason's life was crumbling around him, just like mine had. For a brief moment I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. The man who had ruined my marriage was now paying the price. But that satisfaction was short-lived, replaced by a deeper, more uncomfortable feeling. Everything was falling apart, for Jason, for Jenny, for all of us. But instead of feeling victorious, I just felt tired. Tired of the drama, the fighting, the endless cycle of blame and betrayal. Greg's text buzzed again. Greg: I heard Jason might be leaving town soon. Can't face the heat. I didn't reply. I just sat there, staring out the window, wondering if maybe, just maybe, it was time for me to walk away too. Days passed, and the chaos that had consumed my life slowly began to quiet down. Jenny's social media posts continued to garner sympathy, but it was clear the attention was dying off. People were moving on, finding new gossip to entertain themselves with. Meanwhile, Jason had all but disappeared. The rumors about him leaving town were still swirling, and though part of me wanted confirmation, I couldn't bring myself to ask around. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. The town's focus had shifted, but my life was still in shambles. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. People who used to greet me warmly now looked at me with a mix of curiosity and pity. Some still stopped to chat, offering half-hearted condolences as if I'd just suffered a public tragedy. In a way I had. But instead of mourning a loved one, I was mourning the life I thought I had, the one that had been destroyed, not just by Jenny's betrayal but by my own actions as well. It was a Friday evening when everything finally came to a head. I had been avoiding the bars, the places where I knew people would gather and talk. But that night, I couldn't resist. I needed a drink. I needed a distraction. So I found myself walking into the local dive bar, the one Jason and I used to frequent. It was strange being there without him, strange knowing that the man I had once called a friend had been the catalyst for all of this. The bar was buzzing with the usual crowd, but it felt different now. People glanced at me as I walked in, and the whispers started almost immediately. I ignored them, making a beeline for the bar and ordering a double whiskey. The bartender handed it over without a word, his eyes giving nothing away, though I knew he had heard the stories. I took a long sip, feeling the burn in my throat, and for a moment the noise around me faded into the background. But it didn't last long. I felt someone approach before I saw them. Turning slightly, I was met with the last face I expected to see, Jason's wife Laura. Her expression was a mix of anger and exhaustion, her eyes red and puffy, as if she had been crying for days. "Mike," she said, her voice strained, "we need to talk." I didn't want to talk to her. The last thing I needed was another confrontation, another reminder of everything that had happened. But something in her tone stopped me from brushing her off. She wasn't angry, at least not at me. I gestured to the seat next to me and she sat down, sighing heavily. The bartender raised an eyebrow at us but didn't say anything. "I know what you did," she started, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I know you're the one who sent me those letters, the ones about Jason." My heart skipped a beat. So she had known all along. I had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed was different. I braced myself for whatever she was going to say next. "I should be furious with you," she continued, her hands gripping the edge of the bar. "You destroyed my family. But the truth is you just sped up what was already happening." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Laura let out a bitter laugh. "You think I didn't know? I've known about Jason's cheating for years. I just didn't want to face it. I thought maybe if I ignored it long enough he'd change. But he didn't. And when I got those letters it was like a wake-up call. I couldn't pretend anymore." Her words hit me harder than I expected. All this time I had thought I was delivering the ultimate blow, shattering their marriage the way mine had been shattered. But in reality, their relationship had been crumbling long before I got involved. "I didn't send those letters to hurt you," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if that was entirely true. I wanted him to feel what I was feeling. I wanted him to pay for what he did to Ma." Laura nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "I get it, believe me I do. But you should know, Mike, Jason isn't the only one to blame here." I looked at her, startled. "What do you mean?" She turned to face me fully, her gaze piercing. "Jenny, she wasn't some innocent victim in all of this. I don't know what she's been telling you, but from what I heard, she was just as much of a willing participant as Jason was, maybe even more." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I had spent so much time focusing on Jason, on his betrayal, that I hadn't fully considered the extent of Jenny's role in it. Sure, I knew she had cheated, but part of me had always assumed she had been swept up in it, that maybe Jason had manipulated her the way he had manipulated everyone else. But if what Laura was saying was true, "Jenny's not innocent," Laura continued, her voice hard. "She knew exactly what she was doing. And when things got tough, she used you as her scapegoat. She played you, Mike, just like she played everyone else." The weight of her words settled over me, heavy and suffocating. Had I been so blinded by my anger toward Jason that I hadn't seen the full picture? Had I been a pawn in Jenny's game all along? "I didn't want to believe it," I said quietly, more to myself than to her. "But maybe you're right." Laura stood up, her eyes softening just a little. "Look, I'm not here to make you feel worse. I just thought you should know. Jason's gone. He left town yesterday. Maybe that's what you wanted, but don't let it eat you alive, Mike. It's not worth it." I watched her walk away, her words lingering in the air long after she was gone. Jason had left. The man who had ruined my marriage, the man I had spent weeks plotting against, was finally out of my life. But instead of feeling victorious, I just felt empty. As I finished my drink, the realization hit me. In my quest for revenge, I had lost more than I had gained. I had lost my marriage and my peace, and now, even the satisfaction of seeing Jason's downfall felt hollow. Jenny had played me, and now it was time to face the truth. As I left the bar, the cool night air hit me, clearing my head just enough for me to make a decision. It was time to confront Jenny, not for revenge but for closure. The drive to Jenny's apartment felt like the longest of my life. Every mile, every turn, I replayed Laura's words in my mind. Jenny had played me. She wasn't some innocent victim swept up in Jason's lies and manipulation. She had been an active participant, maybe even the instigator. The realization gnawed at me, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. When I pulled up outside her building, the sky was darkening, casting long shadows over the street. I hadn't called or texted ahead. This wasn't a conversation I wanted to give her time to prepare for. I needed to see her face when I asked the questions that had been haunting me since Laura's revelation. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought she wasn't home, but then I heard footsteps. The door swung open, and there she was, Jenny. She looked surprised to see me, her face a mix of guilt and something else, something harder to read. "Mike," she said cautiously, stepping back to let me in. "What are you doing here?" I walked past her without a word, standing in the middle of her small living room. The last time I'd been here, everything had felt different. Back then, I still believed in the lies we had built together. Now the place felt cold and empty, like a stage where the final act of our failed marriage was about to play out. "I know everything, Jenny," I said, turning to face her. "I know about you and Jason. I know what really happened." She blinked, her expression faltering. "Mike, I cut her off, my voice sharp. "Don't lie to me. I've spent months blaming Jason, thinking he was the one who seduced you, who ruined everything. But that's not the whole story, is it?" She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. "I talked to Laura," I continued, watching as her face paled. "She told me everything. You weren't some helpless victim. You knew exactly what you were doing. You wanted this as much as he did." Jenny's eyes flashed with something. Fear, anger, maybe both. For a moment, I thought she was going to deny it, to keep spinning her web of lies. But then something shifted in her. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a long, defeated sigh. "You're right," she said quietly. I knew what I was doing. The admission hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I'd already suspected it. Hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way that nothing else could. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this to us? To me?" Jenny looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't know," she said softly. I was unhappy, Mike. I was tired of feeling like I was just going through the motions. Jason made me feel alive again, made me feel like I was wanted. It wasn't about you, it was about me." Her words stung, but they weren't a surprise. Deep down I had always known that our marriage had cracks. We had stopped communicating, stopped connecting in the ways that had once mattered. But knowing that didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. "You could have told me," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You could have talked to me instead of sneaking around behind my back." "I know," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know I should have. But by the time I realized how far I'd gone, it was too late. And then you found out, and everything just exploded." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. I stood there, staring at the woman I had once loved, the woman who had shattered my trust. I had come here for answers, for closure, but now that I had them, I wasn't sure what to do with the pieces of my broken life. "I'm sorry," Jenny said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted to hurt you like this." I let out a bitter laugh. "You didn't just hurt me, Jenny, you destroyed me. You destroyed everything we had." Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't find it in me to care anymore. I had spent too long wallowing in my own pain, letting her actions dictate my life. It was time to let go. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you," I said quietly, my voice steady for the first time since I'd arrived. "But I can't keep holding on to this anger. It's killing me, and it's not going to fix anything." She nodded, wiping at her tears. "I understand." There was a long pause, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. I could have stayed longer, could have asked more questions, but what would have been the point? The damage was done. Nothing she said could change the past. "I'm leaving," I said, turning toward the door. "Mike, wait," she called after me, her voice desperate. "Where are you going?" I paused, my hand on the doorknob. "I don't know," I admitted. "But wherever it is, it's going to be without you." And with that, I walked out, closing the door on that chapter of my life for good. As I stepped into the cool night air, I felt something shift inside me. Not peace exactly, but something close. It wasn't a perfect ending, and it certainly wasn't the one I had imagined when I started down this path of revenge. But it was over. I had faced the truth, and now I could finally begin to move on. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again.